Go ahead, David.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is David Crombie, and I'll be your host for tonight. Let me begin by introducing our guest panelists tonight. All of them have had substantial experience and background in the world of urban life and urban planning, and they have some thoughts about the future. Let me begin by introducing, first of all, Marcy Burchfield. Marcy is the Vice President of the Economic Blueprint Institute, which is at the Board of Trade. But for many, many years, Marcy's been at the forefront of regional planning, somewhere around 2 decades. She worked in the growth plan of the Greater Golden Horseshoe. She worked in the Greenbelt Plan, and she worked in regional transportation plan known as the Big Move, for example. Joe Berridge. Joe Berridge is an urban planner and city builder, founding partner of Urban Strategies, Inc. He plays a major role, I'd say plays a major role in urban regeneration around the world, in Canada, in the United States, in the UK, in Asia. And in Toronto, you'll find his work reflected in Exhibition Place, the Waterfront, the Growth Plan, and Metrolinx, and many other projects. Matthew Blackett. Matthew Blackett is the founder, publisher, and creative director of Spacing Magazine. He serves also as an advisor at Ryerson University's City Building Institute. And he works and still works with many, many groups and organizations in Toronto, such as the Roundtable on the Beautiful and Clean City, the Toronto Pedestrian Committee, and so on. Many of those. And people know of Matthew's work through the great magazine that he publishes. Our topic tonight is the shape of things to come, Toronto circa 2031. Even before the current pandemic times, major changes in the economic, social, and environmental life of Toronto were already being predicted on a regular basis. During the pandemic, and as we contemplate our post-pandemic future, these changes have perhaps come into even sharper and clearer focus. So tonight, we thought it would be interesting to take a peek at what may be in store for us over the next decade. So we're going to begin now, and we're going to begin with Marcy.
Thank you, David. Hello, everyone. And I think this is a great kickoff to what, will be an exercise in crystal balling, I think, given our current state of everyone locked down due to a pandemic. But I wanted to start by just acknowledging partly the shape of the future is somewhat connected to the shape of the past. And, in our region, we've been growing. And when I say region, everyone has sort of a different definition of the region. And I think, we talked about this early on, that really our region is the broader Greater Golden Horseshoe. There could be subsets of that geography. But generally in that area of the Greater Golden Horseshoe, which extends from Waterloo region through all the way through the Greater Toronto area and Hamilton, and includes Niagara, Simcoe County, and areas to the east, including Northumberland. It's a fairly large geography, but it's been growing by 100 to 125,000 people per year since the beginning of the millennium. And in response to that, because we do not have a regional body here, the province acts as our de facto regional planner, and they introduced early on in 2006 the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe, which is really a plan that is supposed to provide a set of rules for all the municipalities in that region to accommodate, the fast pace of growth. And it was partly due to the fact that negative consequences were happening because of so-called unplanned growth, and the rapid growth that we were experiencing, such as congestion. If you believe it or not, they were worried about garbage and where you put all the garbage at the time. I've got a great picture of Hazel McCallion and others talking about that dilemma back when the growth plan started. And then, of course, we introduced Metrolinx, a regional transportation agency that introduced its big move plan. Because really the response was, we've had all this growth for many, many years, and we really were not keeping pace with that growth in terms of building the infrastructure, the transit infrastructure in particular, to support that growth. And then the first 10 years of our growth in the region, it was really suburban dominated. And both from a population perspective, but a lot of the jobs were starting to cluster in certain areas of the suburbs, and again, not keeping pace with connecting people to those jobs, with the exception of the car. But what I want to posit, though, that I think is a bit of a trajectory shift. We've always experienced this, not always, but we've certainly in the last couple of decades experienced this 100 to 125,000 people, come into this region through immigration. But really, in 2016, the trajectory of that growth just took a dive up, and part of that, I think, what people don't quite realize is that it was really in response to a number of different things. One, what was happening to the south of us. In 2016, we had a president of the United States that didn't welcome immigrants into the country as much as previous presidents had. And Canada initiated policies that attracted those immigrants to Canada, and specifically, a lot of them ended up in the Toronto region. The Global Express Entry Program, which started in 2015 and really took off in 2016 and 2017. What it did was it allowed people who are skilled workers in a particular area, in particular tech was a big one, allowed them to land in Canada and work in Canada and live in Canada within 2 weeks of a job offer. And that was a good thing for us. That was a good thing. It's no coincidence that basically in 2018, Toronto was the tech capital of North America. It became the one of the fastest growing regions in North America in 2017 and 2018. But as I said, that trajectory of growth really took off during this time, and the shift of where people moved was less in the suburban areas and more in the city. And I think what we saw through that, that sort of that time was, increase in housing prices, affordable housing, a bit of a dilemma, and then we were behind the eight ball in terms of building transit and enough transit to accommodate our growth. But that trajectory of growth, we all felt it on the subways, on the streetcars, on the GO trains. And I think when we talk about what's next in the future, certainly we hear all of, even during the pandemic, there are tech companies and media companies that are still landing in Toronto, still building, their businesses in Toronto, again, being a tech hub of the world. I mean, as I said, 2018, when it was deemed that, it produced more tech jobs than Silicon Valley, Washington, and Seattle combined. And so I think in terms of going in the future, is we won't have that impetus of students going to universities and choosing Toronto and choosing our region because of fears of policies in the South. We won't have that same kind of fear mongering of immigrants from the current president. So will that trajectory of growth be the same? We absolutely will continue to grow through immigration. But my question is, when we look at 2031, will that trajectory of growth be the same? Will we need, and if it is the same, what we need to do is really think more about connecting the dots between housing, between building transit, between understanding where our job growth is, for this region to really grow in a way that is not going to create the externalities, the congestion, and the high housing prices that we experienced before the pandemic. So maybe I'll stop there, and I'll let my fellow panelists give their take.
That was just great, Marcy. Exactly what we're looking for. Thank you, Joe. It's up to you.
Okay, hello everybody, and I forgive for being improperly dressed for this evening's presentation. I'm just saying it's the first time I've ever put bug spray on for a presentation, but I'm having Wi-Fi issues, so I'm stealing the Wi-Fi from the local pub. Okay, Marcy said a lot of the things. I agree with the substance of what she's saying. If you want to know what the future is going to be like, take a good look at the past. COVID is changing some things, but by no means all of the things that's happening. I think that the economic growth of Toronto, which is the fundamentally important thing in any city, the economic growth of Toronto is going to continue and potentially even pick up. Her points about tech are absolutely right. You may have seen an article in the Globe and Mail this week amplifying those things. Of all periodicals, magazines, The Spectator, one I'm sure that we all read, a fairly right-wing English magazine, just came out with a rave about Toronto this week. Interestingly, they were saying if this big rail merger goes on, which I'm sure Kansas City and CN or CP, that apparently, for reasons that I certainly knew nothing about, is going to be incredibly strong for Toronto as well. Those fundamentals, and one must remember, cities are basically economic engines. If they don't have an economic engines, they fade and all kinds of problems happen. We have had the luxury in Toronto really since the beginning of this century to have had uninterrupted growth of great strength, but enough of us may have been around to know what it was like in the early 90s, or if you were in Montreal in the 70s and 80s and 90s. We need to make sure we do pay attention to that, because all things flow essentially from people being able to make the lives they want to make. The other thing that has to be said about Toronto, which is not going to change, is this extraordinary quality of life. And again, we're terribly self-critical folk, but and right now we are justly concerned about inequality. Well, if you look at the numbers, Toronto is the least unequal metropolitan area in the developed world, and has numbers that contrast well to Scandinavia and other such places. The fundamentals that we have a really good public education system, a really good public library system. We have great parks. We have the University of Toronto ranked 18th in the world. That costs you $9,000 to go to. And I promise you, if you don't have the 9,000, don't worry, you'll get in. This is quite extraordinary that these kinds of institutions have had such longevity. There is no city that I'm aware of in our competitors, and we're now one of the top 10 cities in the world by whatever ranking you want to put us in. None of those top 10, I would argue, would a middle-class person send their children to the public school system, except Toronto. And why this is so absolutely important is that we are also the city with the biggest immigration flows of any of the global cities. We're taking 125,000 people again, as Marcy was saying. Frankly, if you listen to federal policy, that could go up to 150,000. And this is done, and again, we're all sackcloth and ashes about this, but it is done more harmoniously than any other big city I know. And the public school system is the crucial the call for that. Plus, we have really good child benefits. Plus, we have really good old age pensions. Plus, we just brought in COVID wage support programs. Those things are really, really important in making the great city. So I think what's fascinating about Toronto, and the reason it's such a marvelous city and such an infuriating city simultaneously, is that it does the fundamentally important things really, really well. It does the less important things like major public interventions on the waterfront or wherever you might like, or the transit system or everything else, really, frankly, much less well than most cities do. And I think that this is going to be something that COVID is going to etch out. I think we are going to see quite a shift from the 416 to 905 in office. And I doubt that the office population will grow. The square footage may not shrink, but and I think people are going to not want to be jammed in the way that they were. They're going to work 3 days a week, not 5 days a week. And this means that they're probably office jobs follow where people live. And I think they are going to move into the 905, which I don't, if it's managed probably, won't be that much of a problem. I think you're going to see enormous changes in retail. We're already seeing that, what I'd call the retail triage. You know, we've all got used to shopping online in cardboard boxes. That isn't going to change back. So you're going to see essentially I think the disappearance of up to a third, maybe a half of shopping centers, and the concentration in the really big solid ones. And I suspect a reasonably strong Main Street at the other end of it. A Main Street's largely serving coffee and food rather than anything else. The two really worrying things, and we're planners, so we have to worry. The first one has been mentioned, housing affordability. If we're going to 150,000 people a year, we can't cope with 120,000 people a year. 120,000 people is, you know, count it how you like, but maybe 40,000 households. We're building 20 to 30,000 units every year. So we're getting deeper and deeper and deeper in the hole every year. And this is a huge problem and requires a much more energetic response than we have done so far. The one that keeps me awake at night is transit. Pre-pandemic, the TTC was not increasing its ridership, nor was London Transit, nor was the MTA in New York, nor was Paris Transit. Transit may well have peaked pre-pandemic. Why? Because have you ever been on the Yonge Street line? Have you ever, even my lovely Spadina LRT is just jammed to the gills. It's really not a nice experience. And I think people are not going to go back, and their work patterns are going to mean they're not going to go back, and the greater dispersion means they're not going to go back. We could have a serious, I don't want to say catastrophe on our hands, but I think we have got a system that is fatally wounded. And we can talk more about some ways we can get out of that. So that's enough, ending with doom and gloom. But basically, the fundamentals that make Toronto an attractive place for all of us to live in, but more significantly, 150,000 new people who create a really good life for themselves. That's the city that will endure.
Well done, Joe. Thank you very much. Matthew, up to you.
Well, thanks for having me and being part of this discussion. I find this topic like interesting for, first as obviously as an urbanist, but second, back in 2018, I helped release a book through our magazine called Toronto 2033, which were 10 short stories speculating on a future of Toronto post-pandemic. The plot line was that there was a major pandemic in 2020 28 or 2000 and yeah, and started at the Olympics, and it dispersed from there. And what was interesting about this book was that we explored, it was about 5 years after, and we explored what life was like post-pandemic. And so that was a very interesting process to go through. And then, you know, basically a year and a couple of months later, we have a pandemic on our hands. In our book, we have a mayor that gets elected that is a former medical officer of the city, and we have people that are having a more medical kind of background seeking public office. So I don't know if that's actually going to be something that we have something to look forward to, but it, you know, that kind of rational, kind of smart analytical thinking that I think some of our doctors and people in our medical community would be a great injection into our political system, I would say. Something that I saw, it was actually earlier today, Canadian urbanist Brent Tondarian had a quote or had a tweet saying that cities embrace the challenges that COVID exposed are the ones that are going to succeed in the future. It's because they've recognized the inequalities, whether it's in transportation or housing, and they've embraced the opportunity to make that change. The ones that are going to go back to normal and try to keep things the way they were are the ones that are going to suffer. And so we're going to have cities that are going to have inequalities just between them, the cities that are actually moving forward in a progressive and I think intelligent way. But I think the three things thinking about the future and you know 10 years down the road is I have three topics that I want to think of. One is how we move, how we come together, and how we live. And I think both of Joe and Marcy have kind of covered off a number of these points. But how we move is obviously critical. And you know I see a future where we are driving less. But that might be for those reasons that I think Joe talked about. Maybe there will be more office space out in the suburbs where people are living, and their commutes are coming down from an average of an hour, over an hour, to half an hour to 20 minutes, those types of things. So maybe there will be a bit more embrace of public transit from some of those people. Maybe there won't. I share Joe's skepticism and fear about that. But I think active transportation has a real chance. There's a real window right now to begin to talk more about more robust bike networks and systems and trails and those types of things, and looking at the variety of mobility choices that people have, whether it's e-vehicles or e-scooters or e-bikes or e-mopeds or whatever those things are coming down the pipe. So I think that is fundamentally going to change. If we look back a decade, if we look back to 2011 and how we moved around, it's a much different world that we live in now, just technologically, whether it's Uber, whether it's bike share and those types of things. So I think that's going to play a fundamental. How we live, you know, this is a housing issue. We're a housing crisis in our region, and how we address that is going to be really important. I have no special insight onto where we're headed, and I can't make any kind of prediction about that. I don't think I'm in a good position to make any kind of anything authoritative on that front. But that is going to change. We're already seeing it in laneway suites and garden suites in Toronto. Hopefully we can maybe see a greater variety of housing types in our suburbs, and them not afraid about changing the character of a neighborhood by putting a second front door on a house, which is something that's happening in the inner suburbs of Toronto. You can't get you can't get some permits to change a place to make a large 4,000 square foot house into 2 units of 2,000, because that front door can't be changed. That's gonna ruin everything. So and then that also means embracing climate change. How are we going to embrace climate and how we live? And so how are we bringing that into our daily lives in our house, and what kind of changes are we making? And then the final thing is how we come together. Obviously, I think people are desperate right now to be able to get into a space where they can talk to people and be social and not be cautious about anything from that. And this is if I could, if there's one positive for me about the pandemic as being someone that has been advocating for the value of public space, I think the pandemic has highlighted that 10 times over, why we need wide sidewalks, why we need protected bike lanes, why we need well-maintained green spaces and park spaces, and why we need our ravines to be accessible to everyone, and why we need an amazing park system down where people live in small places down on the waterfront and downtown, why we need greater access to green spaces and those things. So how we come together in our public spaces is going to be I think there's going to be a change in the next 10 years about how we do that, and it'll be interesting to see how that actually develops. The changing attitudes amongst city councilors is never where I think anyone in the world of urbanism or planning and urban design really want it to be. But there is a greater understanding, not all of them, but there is a greater understanding of why we need a dynamic public realm to a city, and we're lucky, as I think Joe outlined, why we are in a fortunate position. And if we can actually get our act together, how much better of a urban center and region and city we can be. So I'll turn it back over to David at this point.
Thank you, Matthew. That was great. Do you want to pick up on anything that the others have said to the panel? I mean, some of you covered the same ground, but there were some new thoughts in each one of you. I didn't know if you wanted to pick up any comment being made by other panelists. If not,
just one thing. I've been riding my bike more and more. I'm a big user of the Bloor Danforth bike lane. I'm a big user of the University Avenue bike lane. Before pandemic, 1.6% of Torontonians in the region cycled to work. I mean, I would love this to be the magic direction, and obviously we should go in that direction. But I worry that if you focus on that, to use the awful intersectional language, you are essentially helping the privileged and not the people who really need investment. What this pandemic demonstrated is that the Northwest and the Northeast of the city are the places that we have not been investing in at all in terms of public space and public realm and compatible redevelopment. And they desperately need it. And so, my 10-cent solution would be that the city should not spend another penny south of Highway 401 for the next decade. So all the wonderful projects that we all know and love and that we all use, enough. Let's get up into the Northwest and the Northeast.
and that's not just with transportation, Joe. You're talking about housing,
open space, parks,
all of that.
Public space, and bike lanes maybe. But we have focused on. We've been obsessed by the waterfront. We've been obsessed by other sort of grand projets downtown. Enough. Let's all agree to seal our lips for 10 years and only talk about the places that really need help.
That's good. And Mike, sorry, you were going to say something, Marcy?
Well, I was just going to say on that, I think it's also about how to improve their lives by looking at where they're working and getting them better connected to where they're working to. And that might not be in the downtown core. That might be to surrounding suburbs that they work in. I think that's a key piece of making people's lives in those areas that are low income, low opportunity, is to connect them to more opportunities more easily. And I'm not sure some of the prioritize transit projects will do that. I think one of the things that the city is working on, and what's really interesting is the collaboration between the city and what's on the other side of Steeles Avenue and other, that they're actually trying to coordinate bus service, express bus service, so that we can connect more people who are in these areas to jobs that are close to them, but just difficult to get to because transit is not integrated in our system at all.
So do I take it then that I don't want to get too large a sweep on it, but a greater concentration, not in the core of the metro city, but looking at suburbs east and west, northeast and northwest. Is that where we need to be? Both in terms of transit and housing, public space, park, all of those things.
Yeah,
That we
I
is
mean,
that
I think,
collectively?
yeah, Marcy in her former life did this wonderful study that showed that the area around the airport, which sits in 3 municipalities, maybe even 4 municipalities, is the second biggest concentration of employment in Canada after downtown Toronto. It basically has no transit system. It has no public space. It has no there at all. And this is where everybody has suffered from COVID, because essentially they were packing all those cardboard boxes we keep getting. To me, I'm always fascinated by the fact that Central Park was created by the New York City Board of Health. Baron Haussmann was essentially a health engineer, a water engineer. All these great initiatives historically in response to pandemics have come out of the health sector. So why don't we have that same lens on the area which suffered most from COVID, which is the second biggest employment concentration, and that is, frankly, is a completely ignored part of the urban area.
Mm-hmm. And I think the other thing, part of that is, at least within the gates of the airport, my father was an electrician and worked at O'Hare Airport. There's a whole ecosystem of workers and pathways that you can go from one area of the airport that might be, not have high qualifications in terms of skill sets and all that, but you can certainly migrate to other parts of the area. It's an absolutely valuable part of our regional economy that you're exactly right, Joe, has been ignored. Maybe less so in the last few years, but generally has been ignored.
Well, maybe if I could, both Joe and Matthew, and I think as well, you did as well, Marcy, talked about housing, and it is, Joe put it as one of the two, along with transit. Housing is the major worries, and so let me just dwell on it. We can't solve things on housing in a short program, but it's always a mystery to people about why it is the prices continue to get out of reach for people. How do you actually get affordable housing? Who's involved with it? How do we actually bring it together so that there's actually something really being done? I know that there's bits and pieces being done by really stalwart people working away, but there does not seem to be a larger housing story that people can glom onto. Maybe I'm wrong, but let me pick up on housing and see what you've got to say about that. Anybody can start.
Well, let me just start, because Matt is really the man on this. But if you want to do a quick fix, make accessory apartments a permitted use right across the entirety of Toronto.
Accessory housing, Joe?
Yeah, so you can, secondary apartments all you have to do is buy a front door, as you said, or you don't even have to do that particularly. But various analysts have suggested that act alone could create 300,000 to 400,000 new units. And I think we need to have almost an emergency power situation to create that amount of housing. Doing more permanent new build, because what's happening, just again, the population of what's called the yellow belt, that's the part of the Toronto where it is zoned exclusively for housing, which makes up 75% of the urban area. The population of that area has been static, if not declining. It's extraordinary, the population declines right across the traditional residential areas. So they once had all kinds of people in them. Now they don't anymore. And essentially, we've got to remove the regulatory barriers to letting more people in. Then there's another much more complicated thing about how you build new, which perhaps we can talk on a bit. But Matt,
Okay.
I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Now, okay, let's do that if we could. Could we continue on more thoughts on using existing stock better, and then go on to new? Because I think dealing with the housing is really important. So let's,
Yep.
any more thoughts on how we, maybe Joe has put it well and Matt started it, but how we make sure that we are getting the best out of what we've already got, which is clearly not what we're doing now. Anybody, Matt, do you want to continue with,
Well,
you had
I
the
think-
great thought. Go ahead.
I think Joe just nailed on the head. Is like, it's half the problem is housing is about policy. We have a lot of space, we have a lot of housing, we don't have a lot of places that are available. So there's a disconnect. I think Joe talked about it. It's about opening up those accessory units that can be done. Things like laneway suites and garden suites are nice. They're very gentle density. But they won't have a real impact on the housing rental market or affordability. Essentially that's about taking. They want to take the basement apartment out of the house and put it into the garage area. That's kind of like the kind of thinking behind something along those lines. But I don't think I have any more insight than I think what Joe was able to kind of put forth, and I think Marcy could probably add more than I think I could. One of our key writers, John Lawrence, senior editor at Spacing, has been writing a lot about this, and this is what he like truly dives into. I make sure all the things are spelled right. So,
Marcy, you have any thoughts?
So I had not heard that figure of 300, 400,000 units. If that is the case, then that's absolutely great, and it's a great way to utilize the stock that's already there. My concern with in terms of is just how you do that effectively, quickly, and I think that's what we need to do if we're going to be welcoming 150,000 people per year. We need an effective solution, and I think that. I think there's lots of, if anyone does a study on, the kind of impervious surface areas of in the Toronto region, there's a lot of areas that we can redevelop. And I think that they're, part of that wonderful study that you had mentioned, Joe, I worked on with Pamela Blay. And one of the things that we can't put everybody in the city of Toronto. That's definitely sure. That's definitely for sure. And I that's part of what the growth plan is all about as well. Is how do you make some rules so that all rules are the same for municipalities and to quickly build some of this housing. But I think what's one of the things that there's opportunities to kind of reimagine and rethink is if there is a shift to suburban offices, part of the reduced demand in some of those spaces was getting there outside of having a car. So there needs to be more transit connectivity to some of these spaces, but also the amenities. There's missing amenities, and so when you look at the populations that the knowledge-based kind of economy and the workers in that economy, they're attracted to things other than just being in the office. And Richard Florida is now kind of deemed the office as it needs to be the social arena essentially. And so I think that there needs to be activities other than just the offices that are in these kind of office parks in the 905 and even in some parts of of Toronto. You can think of Consumer Row and stuff. So adding more additional amenities, and maybe a little bit of that is housing as well, to reimagine some of these areas, because we need to build a lot. That's the point. And so there needs to be more opportunities to really think about how you do that quickly to bring some of the prices down. But also Toronto is going to continue to be, I think anyway, an expensive place to live. Right. It's the capital, commerce capital of Canada. It's going to continue to attract immigrants and people. It's going to continue to attract investors. And so we need to be able to build a continuum of housing that is affordable housing, that is social housing. And we need to figure that out quickly on where we can maximize, sort of public lands to be able to do that quickly.
Oh,
That's really good. Sorry, go ahead, Joe.
No, Marcy, you did right. And what are the easy sites? I mentioned when I was talking before that retail is really going to change. And so the Cedar Brae Mall, the Humberside Mall, and all of these mid-sized 60s malls are getting redeveloped, and they're very easy sites to redevelop, and they're right in the middle of neighborhoods. So there are quite a lot of those, and we're working with Oxford now on Mississauga Square 1, Yorkdale, and Scarborough Town Center. And what are we doing? Adding parking on the parking lots there. So, these are the easy ones to do in terms of new stock. And we should be doing that as quickly as we possibly can. And really, I think city councils and planning departments should say, let's really run hard with the places where we know we can do it relatively quickly.
And I think on that, so I'm going to plug a study that's going to be coming out shortly, but we've identified through my unit at the Board of Trade, the Economic Blueprint Institute, these sort of 5 types of business districts, and regional centers being one of them. And what's common in most of them is that they are some kind of transit hub. So you're not just, it's unlike some of these office parks where there's less transit to them. You're actually building housing on a transit site to connect to other places, potentially other job areas.
So if I could, then let's continue talking. We've had some pretty good conversation about using existing stock, and it's clearly a large number. I think it was 300,000 or 400,000. I think that is true. I mean, I'm a poster child of the missing middle, as they call it. The planners call me the missing middle, and that is that I live with one of my daughters, and we renovated the main floor. She's a widow now. We changed renovated the main floor. There's someone in the basement apartment. There's someone under, and she has 2 floors above for her kids and for hers, and she can go into the lane. The reason I mentioned that, it's a 125-year-old house, and it's got basically 4 floors. So the intensification in the old stock is not to be sort of just poofed away, because it's already got existing amenities that you can also extend. Anyhow, having said all that, I think there's a great future in that. Let me go to the new build stuff again. Joe's right. We got shopping centers and spaces now that could be used. We've got to be smarter on how we're using public lands. Part of it, though, has got to do with how do you make it affordable? And it's not only your ability to build more so that you hope that supply is going to be able to trickle down so the demand's affordable. So I didn't know, years ago, we would talk about co-ops. We would talk about a variety of forms by which we could make it cheaper. And I didn't know what the state of the art was today. So perhaps we could get a comment on that. If we're going to do new build, how do we make it affordable?
Yeah, it's a very tough question because money has never been cheaper. You will remember, David, back in your early years, the feds had something called the limited dividend program, which was
absolutely
essentially cheap money.
Yep.
To build apartments. That's where all the apartments up and down the Yonge Street line came from. Well, we don't need the government to give us cheap money anymore because there's cheap money in the banks. I think this is a very, very tricky question. There's no question that any major development takes 3 or 4 years to get approval. This is probably, I mean, every big city has convoluted approval processes, but ours is probably double the length of a London or a New York or let's just say nothing of a Chicago somewhere. So this and that time costs money. The second avenue, which I actually kind of enthusiastic about, I think modular construction, basically pre-building off-site and stacking a building up like Lego cubes. This is really gathering pace, and all of the big builders are setting up industrial off-site housing construction outfits that can then, you can bring half the house on the back of a truck, stick the other half on the next day. And this could result in significant cost changes as well, I think.
And that would be particularly in already land assembled open spaces like former shopping malls and stuff.
Exactly.
Oh, okay. Anybody else on the housing part before I leave it? I wanted to turn to something far less understandable, and that's governance.
So I would just add, David.
Please do.
Yeah, on the housing front, I mean, I think to get at the affordability piece, all 3 levels of government have to work together on this one, right? The feds are doing quite a bit on the housing front, and trying to incentivize more affordable housing, different types of housing, rental housing. You know, we came together early in this pandemic as 3 levels of government working together to fight, the same thing that was harming all of us who are living in Canada and around the world. We need to do the same thing with housing. There's lots of public land. That's one way of getting that affordable housing. Absolutely, Joe, you're right on the modular housing, reduce some of the cost and in terms of the materials, in terms of the time that it takes to build it. But I do think that there's in order to keep prices down, like, you need some government intervention there. And so part of this is just getting on board. They did it with much of the housing, that the shelter housing that's been popping up through the pandemic. Like, why can't we continue to do that, is my question.
Okay. Just before we leave the housing then, I always thought co-op was a really great idea. It probably had its difficulties, but no one seems to be advocating co-op today. And I just wonder why that would be.
Well, there was always the old line about the problem with co-op housing was that people had to cooperate. And
Fair enough.
I'm not
human nature does us in again.
Human nature may have intervened there.
Okay. Okay. Thanks. This is let me introduce something that actually Marcy started off with, and she talked about regional planning, because that's, generally speaking, a field she's been involved with for a while, and good at it. One of the things that struck me, she said, is that the province is now our regional government.
De facto.
And de facto is a good way to describe it. Now, without going back into too much history and too many weeds, once we got rid of the old metro system and we didn't adopt any other regional framework, metro was a regional government, de facto the provincial government became our regional authority. But I think it needs to be said, whether it almost doesn't matter which, well, it doesn't matter whether we had an NDP government or a Liberal government or conservative government. There is no framework that's understandable, let alone by the public, but by municipalities, other than episodic events or from time to time we'll get together. There's certainly no democratic framework where you have a representative where you can take your ills and concerns to. So I wondered if regional government, other than the provincial government practicing it as it will at a whim, is that all we're ever going to get from a regional approach?
Well, and I think worse is that, sometimes the province has interest in it and sometimes the province doesn't have interest in it. So if you also need not just accountability, but consistency on these matters, especially when you're welcoming what could be 150,000 people per year.
Yeah, and regional planning has been part of the urban planners framework since Mumford. I mean, since the old regional planning association.
Ebenezer Howard. Let's go back.
Ebenezer Howard, even earlier. Sorry, Joe. So it's been around a long time, but it is now hardly ever talked about. And while it works, it is episodic, and it comes from no coherence that certainly the public can't understand.
Well, one of the things this is a fascinating question, and one of the things I did when I was traveling around the world working was to ask, how do these cities work? How do they manage regional issues? How do they manage local issues? And you come to the conclusion that the cities that are best organized, probably London, Paris, and New York, are best organized because they have a 2-tier system. And essentially they have a formally constituted, more or less formally constituted regional government. Manchester, another place I've done a lot of work, has done the same thing now. And the structure changes from place to place. But typically the upper tier has the major powers over budget, over transit, over policing, over housing, over major redevelopments, over environment. The local tier worries about backyard parties, front yard parking, and all the crucial issues that local people are really concerned about. What we have, I think, by any international comparison here, is the worst MASH in Toronto. We
Right
have
on.
what you might call the Metro Toronto, the city of Toronto, which is less than a half of the urban population right now, will be down to a third of the urban regional population very shortly. And it has 25 folks who represent individual wards, and they've become a gerontocracy of essentially pale male stale. And they really are rotten boroughs, because seats are handed down from family to family to family. And apart from a few wonderful people that we all know, very few people on city council have any interest in the big city, because if you have an interest in the big city, it ain't going to get you reelected. So I assure you, exactly those people exist in the London borough of Bromley, or in the Bronx, or in one of the Paris arrondissement, but they don't control the show. The bigger government controls the big things. The difficulty you have in Toronto is that it's impossible to conceive of a level of government of 10 million people in a province of 16 million people. It will never happen. So every jurisdiction has a burden to carry, and this is our burden. All of the studies that have been done to try and figure out how to make it better, and David, you've been involved in an awful lot of them, stumble on this fundamental facts of on the ground of where the population is and how big the province is. And so I worry. I particularly worry that we will not be able to do the crucial thing we have to do, which is to reinvent the transit system post-pandemic, because we have terrible transit management governance. And yeah, that's my 10 cents.
Yeah, not to dwell on the governance thing a lot, but Joe, it seems to me that if we maybe our approach, as you just so implied, that we can't do it for the range of public services, but at least there should be some kind of sectoral approach to services, so that people got some predictability and understanding of how the system works. Yeah. I mean, that even if the province, for example, pushing it up to yesterday's news, even if the province wants to have things happen, it uses ministerial zoning orders, not necessarily and only because it's a bad thing to do, but because there's no other way that they can move forward the ball that they think needs to be pushed forward. So it's a testimony to our inability to solve it. So maybe it needs to be done sectorally, but there we go. Good for you, Joe. You pointed out, nice question, David. No answer.
Well, and I think when you look at the sectoral side of things, that is partly what the pre-pandemic, there was this regional governance review. And I think part of it was around, is there some ability to provide shared services at a particular scale, and looking at what does that look like for policing? What does that look like for water and wastewater and that? So, but I'm also a big fan of cooperation, cooperative models. There you go, David. There's some cooperative models. I know people don't necessarily have to live with each other, but I do think, like we've have the mayors and chairs meeting on a regular basis now on the pandemic. There's more cooperation between city managers that are happening now. Certainly my organization has kind of stirred that, but others have as well. And they see the need to come together to work cooperatively, partly because on the other side of this pandemic, and when senior levels of government funding stop filling the gaps of their revenue holes, there's going to have to be some shared services to maximize their revenues and work in a cooperative kind of way.
Yep. Well, no, and maybe that's it. Maybe we have to go back to maybe older ways in which we did things, and that was by kind of habit and custom and routine and all of that, and not be able to simply use the levers of regional government that we used to know. Possible. I think that's probably true. We have done a really good job
I think
of
Matthew
having.
wanted to get in there.
Oh, I'm sorry, Matthew.
I did.
It's
Well,
my-
I just one of those. I wanted just to make two quick points. One is I think part of the reason why there is very little talk about regional government is the part of the process of dissolving the regional government was to show that it was bad, right? I don't think it was. I don't think you think it. I don't think you was. But it was to delegitimize it and to put into and to try to tamp it down, even though we need it, and it reduced the power of the municipalities. And obviously, that's what the province wanted. They want to have greater say over these things. So unless there is a movement within provincial politics to allow us to be to talk and speak and think as a region, we're not going to really get anywhere. We need I don't know too many people in the province that are willing to want to give up power. I think they would probably not want to make some of the decisions that municipalities want to make, but they still do want to have their fingers in the pot. So I think that's one element to kind of to consider. And then the other one is there's lots of talk. I don't know how substantive it is and actually happening, but there is the talk around charter cities, right? And giving cities some greater control, greater powers. Obviously the City of Toronto has the City of Toronto Act, which theoretically gives it power, but when we try to use it and implements it, it gets taken away from us. So can we move forward with greater actual powers for our municipalities and our cities? I don't have any inside knowledge on this, but I suspect our next federal election will tickle this I think our federal government's trying to make sure that they maintain some urban strongholds, might try to tickle the voter fancy, or at least for those of us that want to see greater control for our municipalities. So I think that may be a little bit of a carrot that gets dangled at some point.
Thank you very much. Matthew, let me actually, maybe the other side of your point. I think one of the underutilized resources in terms of democratizing what has now become the provincial regional approach to government is that we've simply given a pass to the MLAs, because the MLAs are, after all, elected by these people. And for now 175 years, we've gotten used to the proposition that they don't get into these matters. But if the provincial government's into these matters, so are the MLAs. And maybe it's time to look for accountability from them and push. I know already in a couple of issues I'm involved in, we are targeting MLAs, saying, speak up, government caucus. So at any rate, we'll leave that. I was going to say that we're just finishing this segment of the program, and we have gone through almost an hour, and we haven't mentioned, except for Matthew, we haven't mentioned climate change. Now, I don't know whether I don't think it was a plan to do it that way. But one of the things that I remember when we were doing a regional report in 2015, 2017, we did not put a separate chapter in our report, although we had 87 recommendations, on climate change, because there was an assumption that almost in everything we're doing now in the urban planning and development world affects climate change. So we chose to put our recommendations woven in to all of the other issues of housing, transportation, so on. I just wondered how you saw, everybody talks about climate change. Where does it fit into our agenda over the next 10 years?
Well, I'll just throw something out. If we are going to, the one thing cities can do very effectively is to foster, enhance, drive the electrification of the vehicle fleet. That's right in their bailiwick. They essentially are able to provide electrical recharging stations. They could put up road tolls which differentiate between different types of vehicles. There are a lot of other things in terms of housing construction, which I think is largely done now. The big thing that we've got to change, and change quickly, is what we put, the fuel that drives cars. And you can see Paris, London, and New York have all said by sometime between 2030 and 2040, no more gas-powered vehicles in our city.
Right.
You know, that I think we've got to move at that level of vigor.
No, and it's that's a very large fight, a large part of the answer is dealing with carbon, for sure. Thank you. Anyone else, Marcy?
I think it starts with the bus fleets as well, right? Like, I think that's the first key thing to
their own bus fleets.
Yeah. And I think it comes back to regional coordination on this, right? Like, why does York Region, Toronto, Durham, Peel, why are we not looking at the borders, like to put, our electrical charging stations? Like, so this is going to be an expensive endeavor. So, and looking at bus fleets charging, along with sort of other types of fleets, whether they're, logistics fleets or what have you, like looking at where are the points that those stations need to be located, kind of co-use of those stations, I think are kind of how we're going to be able to do it from a scale perspective across the region. But yes, absolutely. Like, how I think there's other incentives that the federal government has to make in terms of incentivizing buying those electric vehicles, because it's not a cheap endeavor for families who rely on cars to get to work to have to buy a new thing. So I think there's going to have to again be cooperation between levels of government as well for us to really mainstream and accelerate climate change mitigation.
Good for you. Thank you.
I just know it's Matt.
Matthew?
I would just like to add that it was within the last couple of months where I believe solar energy has the cost of it has it's much cheaper now than oil production, and so we've kind of hit that tipping point with it, and so that I think that's going to be important too, because as homeowners and stuff like that, we can put solar on our roofs, and that means we're not draining energy from our power plants and that type of stuff. So I think those types of things I think are I think everyone is what we've been talking about is going to hit the key, but it's the gasoline. It's not using that, and it's about how we heat and cool our homes is going to make such a huge impact on climate change for us.
Right.
There's a lot of leadership actually at the municipal level on this already, even before change of government down south, and certainly on the federal level. The city of Toronto did transform TO. That's a good kind of playbook of how to move forward on reducing carbon in the city. And heat pumps is one thing that I know I was part of that process, and there's got to be a lot of conversion of from gas to these sort of heat pumps that has to happen. But even Durham region, and there's a lot of folks, a lot of municipal leadership on the climate change file that I think we really need to sort of get behind and move forward with it.
Can I ask whether that's a really good point, Marcy? Maybe others may have a response as well. Has that been more bureaucracy's understanding if they've got a leadership role here, as opposed to necessary the politics of it and politicians? I don't mean that to discount them, but it strikes me that there's a kind of coalescing of opinion in bureaucracies that they have a leadership role to play here. Would that be right?
Yeah, absolutely. It certainly seems like it, especially on the climate change file, because they understand it. People can debate whether we take streetcars or build subway lines and stuff like that, but it's a lot different when you're dealing with like the lake levels and temperature rising and such like that. It's much harder thing to debate, and I think our bureaucracy is done quite a really good job of weaving climate change into a lot of their policies. I think that's just a decade of a lot of pushing and that's going on. It certainly seems from when I started spacing, which was in 2003 to 2021, there has been a dramatic shift within the bureaucracy of how they approach these things. Effectiveness, that's a whole other thing that we can talk about, but clearly from a leadership perspective, as you're addressing, they have certainly played a role in changing attitudes on that.
Okay, thank you.
Councils have to put budget behind it, and they have, I think, too.
Yeah.
I think that you know, like certainly for Transform TO, budget was put behind it.
And you found
so,
that, did we find that as well, Marcy, outside of Toronto in major municipalities?
yeah,
for example?
certainly, yeah. Like
Mississauga.
there's a lot of leadership that's happening in Durham region right now around you know, how to bring down, like, so they're doing new build out there, and they're also transforming their bus systems and that. So so again, it's budget, it's like budget that has to happen. So it has to be both. But there are definitely a lot of civil service leaders who are good folks who are moving this file forward and convincing budgets or councils to put budget behind it.
Yep. Okay, I'm going to call on Mariah to see what questions we have from the audience for you folks. But as I get Mariah, is there any final comment on these matters we've been talking about? Okay, Mariah, have we got some questions?
We do have a couple questions. The first one here is there an emerging technology that might make a big change for Toronto in 2031?
An emerging technology. I'll certainly have to ask the panels for that. Does anybody have any?
I'll throw something out. If you have an electric car, your choices to recharge are incredibly limited. I'd like to have, you know, this is like car vaccination stations, okay, with electricity. So why don't we just go completely over provide everywhere so that we build the market, because we need to do a sea change in attitudes towards electrification. And as Marcy said, people, already own cars. They got to trade them in. You want to trade them in quicker. But you know, I wouldn't know where to get my car electrified. I know in the garage in my building, there are no electric power points. Every single apartment building should be required to have charging stations. There should be charging stations every 500 meters on major streets. We just really go strong and public and advertise and build the market.
Okay. I have a question out of that, though, Joe, and maybe it's not appropriate for me to raise it here, but I will. After all, it's my program.
It's your show.
But it strikes me that if we are going to do that, at the same time we're limiting cars on streets, limiting parking. You're doing, as we expanded into the 20th century. We changed cities by accommodating the automobile. We seem to be so far in the 21st century cutting back on that, and narrowing streets, narrowing opportunities, narrowing pockets. So just electrification of automobiles, does that not run into?
No, it's not. I mean, but you know, good city management recognizes facts on the ground. The fact on the ground is that 2/3 of people pre-pandemic drove to work. So you've got to, if you want to change those numbers, you've got to do all the things we're doing with transit, and hopefully get those numbers right down so that people don't use their cars to go to work. But if we won't do that in time for climate change, this is an emergency. So we've got to say, while we're stopping people or providing alternative ways of getting around, let's just change everything to electric as quickly as we can.
I hear you. Okay. Anyone else with an outstanding technology and an answer to this question?
Well, I will just I'll kind of second Joe about the electrification of the car, but it is about batteries. So you're seeing things like e-scooters, e-mopeds or e-motorcycles. I think that's the next thing possibly that will come is from bike share model will be like e-motorcycles or some variation of something like that, or mopeds. So we'll see some of that. So batteries, I think, are really something key. We see power assisted just bikes, normal bikes. And what I think that's done is that's allowed people with some physical mobility issues to get out actually and ride their bike and get up a hill. They can no longer does going north on a major road going towards St. Clair become that huge obstacle of whether I'm going to ride a bike or not. There's many places in the city as well. It is a pretty flat city. There are some treacherous places to get around. So battery, I think, is good. You see it on skateboards now. So and you'll see it just with a whole range of different ages of people using it. And so what will that turn into? We look at how food is delivered through Uber Eats. I see a guy riding essentially like an electric unicycle all the time doing it. So batteries are going to play, battery life and storage is going to play a huge part of our lives moving forward. It already does with our phones and computers. But it's going to change about how we move as well.
Yeah, and I would think city tech as well, like aspects of city tech, we use our phone for everything.
Like sensors?
Sorry?
You like sensors? That
Yeah,
type of,
like I think, and the whole shared model, like how do you, to get more people out of cars onto transit, and between modes, right? Like, sharing of scooters, sharing of bikes, sharing Ubers, integrating the whole system. I really do think that we need more of that integration of different modes of travel to really attract people out of their cars into different modes of transportation.
Well, good for you.
I also
Okay.
I will say that I do think sensors and like data sensors are going to be a huge piece of technology.
Yeah.
We're already seeing it right now in the King Street streetcar pilot. So much of that was data that was picked up by cameras and then anonymized and then retransmitted so that we could see how many people are coming off, how many people are going on. I think sensors are going to play a huge part in our daily lives. That's what Google wanted to do down with Sidewalk Labs. They want to be able to put sensors to see how many people were sitting, or if they're heavy or overweight. There's a whole bunch of different stuff on that front. So I think that's going to change the city experience.
As data builders. Huh? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Well, and with that, you're going to need acceleration of 5G, right? Because you cannot have that much information moving from sensors to units for things to learn where people are, without 5G. So with all this technology, you need to have the infrastructure to support that technology.
No, and the investment for that can that be municipal, or does that need to be provincial, or all of them? I mean, that's a big investment, no?
Yeah, sensors and those things are also go, Joe.
Yeah. No, sorry. Again, when I'm sort of wandering around different cities, all the subway lines in Paris and London are privately operated. We all think of it as public transit systems, but actually they're privately operated. And that means that the number one line in Paris is driverless because a driver, again, is a very expensive piece of equipment. And if you can have it driverless, so this is like the Yonge Street line in Paris is driverless. I think we need to do a little bit like what we did with the garbage, which is to shake the whole system up and say everything east of Yonge Street stays with public garbage collection. Everything west, we're going to get imaginative. It keeps everybody honest, but it also allows innovation to happen. And the problem we've got with the crisis we're going to face in transit, where ridership, I think, will permanently be 20% down from what it was. Only our rapid population growth will pull it back up again. Unless we treat it like a consumer service, unless we treat it like buying a really good cup of coffee, not a crummy cup of coffee. So we've got to be much freer in the way we think about grabbing a hold of this revolution, I think, if we're going to make real progress on the climate change front.
And so you think a much stronger role than we've accepted so far from the private sectors is in order, Joe?
I think we've properly regulated, and I stress that. The government is finally, the government sets the rules, but we don't know what the efficiencies are in transit. We don't know. Take the pricing system. Should we have off-peak fares? Most other jurisdictions have off-peak fares, and if work habits change, not traveling in the rush hour, which is when the crowd is, should be fostered and encouraged.
Okay.
So there are all kinds of things that we've never done. Say nothing about fair integration across the region, which is a crime that we haven't got to that yet.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Mariah, we have a second question.
And the question is, can and will the city expropriate the air rights to the rail corridor, allowing for the rail deck park to be a viable reality in 2031?
Well, we'll have to go to Matthew for that one. I know it's a favorite. Anyhow, I'm sorry, Matthew, just picking
That's
on you,
okay.
but there, I don't know the answer myself.
No, the answer is no.
And so far, I think it was 2016 when it was announced. And I don't know that there's been any serious investment, either financially or in any other way, in actually accomplishing it, but that may be being unfair. Joe, do you want to speak?
No,
I'm sorry. No, on this
I'll
one,
say
no.
this one out.
I'm sorry. It's just me being an old guy and not remembering. Because it's not fair to Joe for me to ask him because he has client privileges he has to worry about. Unlike myself, he's successful. So no, just kidding, Joe. Just kidding. So maybe Marcy or Matthew, you have some thoughts.
Well, I can answer the question simply no. I don't think they can do that. I think the air rights have already been sold to a development company. That's the whole deal. But I think rail deck is a failure of the city's. Not so much the last couple of years. I do think they haven't done the best job of specifically articulating how and why they can make rail deck work, but it's a combination of how they use Section 37 over the last 20 years, accumulating over $250 million in the bank, never to be used, to buy green space while property soared. And so the city had multiple opportunities to buy land downtown with the money and create some good green spaces and open spaces down there, and they missed that opportunity. And then they proposed something like I would just say this: the city doesn't do a very good job of maintaining parks. So I don't know why we think that them building a $1 billion park they're going to maintain that very well. So I just don't have a lot of confidence in the city on that front. Look at June Colwood Park, a fantastically designed park, probably one of the most poorly maintained ones I've ever seen, with such design and ideas that have gone into it. So I'm not particularly sad that rail deck didn't work out the way it was proposed, because I didn't think it was actually the right thing for the city to be financing. But though I do think that the space should be turned into some sort of park space. But I haven't read the 110 page the decision on it, but I think there is better opportunity to do stuff right now, to the fact that the city's not going to be as heavily involved in this.
Right. Well, you think there's possibilities to do things with the development that's coming forward if we look for some redesign, Matthew?
I think there'll be more. Well, they've hired a good designer, the landscape designer. It name dropped me that they had a really good one. Marcy,
Okay.
can you? Joe, do you know who it is?
I don't know.
BWS out of San Francisco.
There we go. Thank you.
Okay.
you can say those things, right?
I can say that.
But I just think that you are going to get something probably better than what I think the city would have done or maintained. Though I will say this: I don't believe that the POPs, the privately owned public spaces program that the city has run, has been very successful. But I do think with rail deck, at least right now, the eyes are on that. Eyes aren't on places, those little tiny places at a condo at Avenue Road and somewhere it's this little tiny public space supposedly. People will be paying attention to what goes on down there, and I think will be better for it, and we won't be, I think, burdened with something that is as expensive as it would have been. So
Okay.
That's my personal take on it, though.
Well, thank you. That's good. Marcy, we want to comment?
So
Okay.
I think Matt did a great job of
Yeah.
articulating
Okay, no,
the
okay.
position. But I just want to maybe add that, I think Matt, also in your opening remarks, you talked about the importance of public space, and I'm an avid user of the ravines. You'll often see me tweet with my dog in the ravine, exploring the ravine. But oh boy, lots of people found the ravines during the pandemic. I was there prior to the pandemic, and I was even in the dead of winter. I'm like, wow, there's too many people in my ravine. But I think it's something that we I think the TRCA, for example, the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, I think there needs to be some more strategic ways of cleaning up the ravines, looking at the overuse of the ravines, like what's happening with, I think we need to think about how we're strategically going to use these green spaces and public spaces that people need to, need these days and will need going forward, but also how we're going to maintain them, right? There's lots of friends, there should be more friends of whatever. And public engagement and really participating in maintaining these parks and ravines.
We just need our city councils to actually fund our parks departments and bring back up their budgets for cleaning. I was on the part of the Clean and Beautiful City Roundtable, and that was a great those little policy things, those citizen-run roundtables are really good sometimes because they hold the bureaucracy to account on certain topics, because they make them answer questions that they don't normally get from the city council. But they did park audits of trash audits, and then each year we would ask about them, and they were getting better, and it's because they were being asked questions about it, and it's because at the time David Miller was investing more in parks. So if our cities can just actually invest in parks and actually show that they actually care about them, we'd be in a much better spot, instead of spending billions of dollars reconstructing highways that we don't actually need. So
I do note on the ravines, I think it's 300 kilometers of ravines. It's the striking characteristic of the topography of Toronto with the ravines.
Yeah.
And just recently, the province or the city has announced its ravine strategy, putting some money to it over 10 years. The federal government's got some money as well. The conservation authorities weighing in with it, and so is a regeneration trust. So there's now, I think, for the first time, some at least broad approach to doing something with ravines, which is a vastly, as you point out, Marcy, underrated resource of the city. Yeah. Do we have time for one more question, do we, or two? Mariah, you still with us?
I am. I'm here. We have one more question, and it's actually a request to please say more about the co-op housing model and why it might be viable.
I guess I'm the guy at fault there.
I just like the notion of it, and it did work in its time. The St. Lawrence neighborhood is all co-op, and co-op in those days, in the 60s and 70s, and probably into the 80s, and it began to change. The co-op model worked well. The federal government was required to be involved through CMHC. The provincial government took an interest in it. So the governments were aligned, and developers became builders in the building of them. So it was a good model. And for the reasons for some people didn't like it, because it required that people who had a little more live with people who had a little less. And so therefore it looked like the people who had a little more were somehow slumming, and somehow it gave an odor to it. It's unfair. But at any rate, Joe, I think, probably has a more sophisticated understanding of why it doesn't work. But it just strikes me that the notion was and is that you are able to have multiple housing, which allowed people to have a piece of ownership and gave them a stake in the place. And that's really what it was about. The church groups, the labor organizations, all of those, and they built all those buildings in St. Lawrence. Those are labor co-ops, and those are ethnic co-ops, and those are church co-ops. So it gave, as Matthew was just pointing out, it gave smaller entities a role to play in the development of what was then to be an important piece in dealing with housing issue of that day. Housing affordability was not invented 20 years ago. It was invented 1,000 years ago. So housing affordability is always around. The answer for many in the 60s and 70s, other than government rental and purpose-built, was co-op, and it worked for a while. Now, there we are. That's all I can say about it. Do you have any thoughts, Joe? Or
I
Mars?
think you put it
Or Matt?
lovely.
Yeah, okay.
Okay.
Well, so I do think that there, labor organizations are looking at this issue, particularly when they need workforce, right? I think it might be attached to some of the workforce housing that's needing to be built if there, because from David, when you talk about sectorial, you're talking about the artist co-ops and that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and the labor co-ops, I mean, they're all
Yep.
down to David Cole housing,
Yeah.
all of that
Yeah.
stuff. So at any rate, it was a collective attempt to try and deal with affordable housing and give people a stake, and not simply only by renting by
Right.
government purpose built. That was it.
Mhm.
At any rate, I think that probably, does that take us to the end, Mariah?
It did.
It-
Or I should say,
that
I should say
sounds
we've,
pretty, it sounds
we've
pretty
answered
firm.
all
We
the
can't
questions.
negotiate. That was pretty firm, Mariah.
I should have said we've addressed all the questions.
Oh, okay, good for you. Well, listen, it leaves it to me to thank the panel. It was just really good. It was new things and some old things. It was terrific. So thank you, the three of you, very, very much. And thanks to the audience for being with us tonight. And thanks to the ever efficient Mariah. Thanks, folks.
Well,
Bye for now.
thank you, David.
Thank you, David. Okay. Bye, Joe. Bye, Matt.
Bye.
Bye, Joe.
I thank you for having us.
Okay, thanks. Bye-bye.